The harsh reality of the class. The wind howled through the barren landscape, its icy gusts cutting into the faces of the gathered group. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving. Rocky hills, jagged cliffs, and patches of thick, tangled vegetation stretched as far as the eye could see. The Deathworlders, a team of experienced humans who had survived the most dangerous planet in the galaxy, stood in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the world around them. They had been briefed on the difficulty of the survival class they were about to take, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality that lay ahead. Their instructor, a seasoned alien survival expert named Tharvik, stood before them, his dark eyes piercing through the group. His body was covered in scars, signs of battles fought and survived on countless hostile worlds. His presence alone made the Deathworlders uneasy. This wasn't some training ground where the worst outcome was a bruised ego. This was the real deal. "You think you're prepared?" Tharvik's voice rang out, calm and cold. "You think you've survived everything your homeworld could throw at you, but this planet will show you otherwise. This is no simple test. You will face challenges that you cannot even imagine. And in the end, only those who truly understand survival will make it out." The Deathworlders exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to harsh environments, to being pushed to their limits. Earth was a death world, a place where life fought tooth and nail to survive. But this alien planet, they had no idea what to expect. Tharvik had made it clear that their usual tricks wouldn't work here. Survival wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptability. And in this world, adaptability was a luxury many species didn't have. "Your first challenge begins now," Tharvik announced, motioning to the vast wilderness ahead. "Move out. You have until sunset to make it to the designated checkpoint." The team set off without hesitation, their confidence high. They had survived on Earth, after all. There was no creature in this galaxy that could threaten them, or so they thought. The terrain was more difficult than they had anticipated. As they moved through the rocky hills, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and crack, as if the planet itself was alive. Massive boulders blocked their path, and sharp, thorny plants grew in dense clusters, tearing at their clothing and skin. Even the air was different, thick and humid, with a faint metallic scent that made it hard to breathe. They adjusted quickly, but the unfamiliar environment made them uneasy. As the team pressed on, they started to notice strange movements in the distance. Something was watching them. At first, they thought it was just their imagination. But then they heard the growl, a low, rumbling sound that echoed from deep within the forest. What was that? One of the Deathworlders whispered, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. But Tharvik's voice cut through the air. "Do not be foolish," he said sharply. "This world has creatures you cannot comprehend. Your weapons will do you no good here." The team slowed their pace, realizing that they had underestimated the true danger of the planet. The instructor's warning hung in the air like a heavy weight. They had thought they could handle anything. But now, the reality was sinking in. The wind picked up again, howling across the hills. It seemed to carry a whisper, a faint voice that was almost too soft to hear. The Deathworlders stopped, their eyes darting around nervously. They couldn't understand what it was. Was it the wind, or something else entirely? "We need to keep moving," the leader of the group, a tall, wiry man named Jarek, said, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his gut. "Stay sharp." But as they moved forward, the sounds grew louder. The growls became more frequent, and soon, the Earthlings found themselves surrounded by a thick fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The air grew colder, the atmosphere more oppressive. They could no longer see more than a few feet in front of them. Every step felt like it could be their last. Suddenly, a blur of movement passed through the fog. One of the team members, Lena, screamed as something large and fast darted past her, too quick for anyone to react. The group froze. The fog cleared just enough for them to see what had passed. A massive creature stood in front of them. It was taller than any of them, its body covered in thick, spiked armor, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. The creature's roar sent a chill down their spines, and it was clear that this was no ordinary predator. "Get ready," Jarek shouted, drawing his weapon. But before any of them could react, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed. It was as if the world itself was working against them. Lena, still recovering from the shock of the creature's appearance, barely managed to avoid its claws. One of the other members, Malik, was not so lucky. He was knocked to the ground, and the creature's claws raked across his chest. Blood sprayed into the air. "Malik!" Lena screamed, rushing to his side, but it was too late. The creature had already retreated into the fog, leaving the group in a state of shock. The team stood motionless, their minds racing. The harsh reality of the class had hit them. They had underestimated the planet, and now one of their own had paid the price. The stakes were higher than they had imagined. This wasn't just a training exercise. This was survival, and only the strongest would make it out alive. "Move," Tharvik's voice cut through the tension. This was only the beginning. The Deathworlders nodded grimly. They knew this would be the hardest challenge of their lives, and they were just getting started. The first test. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of Malik's death settling heavily on their shoulders. His blood stained the rocky ground, a grim reminder of just how quickly things could go wrong. The fog had dispersed, but the uneasy feeling remained, hanging in the air like a thick cloud. Jarek was the first to speak, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. "This isn't supposed to happen," he muttered, his eyes flicking to Tharvik. "We're survivors. We've been through worse." Tharvik stood motionless, his expression unreadable. The alien instructor had seen this before. He had seen countless groups of would-be survivors fail in a similar way. The harshest lessons were the ones that cost the most. He didn't flinch at the death, nor did he offer any condolences. For Tharvik, survival wasn't about sentiment. It was about making it through the next moment, the next test. And this was just the first test. "Move, now," Tharvik said, his voice stern, cutting through the tension. "You have no time to waste on regrets. This planet does not care about your emotions. It will kill you as soon as look at you." The Deathworlders hesitated for a moment, exchanging wary looks. The loss of Malik had shaken them more than they wanted to admit, but they understood that dwelling on it wouldn't bring him back. They had to keep moving. Jarek gave a sharp nod, his face hardening. "Let's go." For Malik. They began to march on, each step heavy with the knowledge of what had just happened. The terrain had become even more treacherous, and the weight of their loss seemed to make the land feel even more hostile. Their pace was slower now, more cautious. No one dared to be the first to speak, and the only sounds that filled the air were the crunch of rocks underfoot and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving in the distance. After an hour of trekking, they came across the first real obstacle of the day, a wide ravine, its edges jagged and steep, with no apparent way to cross. The team stopped at the edge, their eyes scanning the dangerous drop below. There was no bridge, no clear path. "Tharvik," Jarek called, his voice tight. "How do we get across?" Tharvik was silent for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the ravine. "There's a way," he finally said, turning his back to the group. "You'll have to figure it out." Jarek clenched his fists in frustration. This wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the answer he'd expected. Tharvik wasn't here to hold their hands. He was here to force them to think, to adapt, to survive. "We have to cross it," Jarek muttered, his voice steely. He motioned for the group to gather around. "We need a plan." The group began to brainstorm, but it was clear they were all struggling. They were used to thinking on their feet, but this situation was different. The ravine wasn't something they could simply overcome with brute force or instinct. They had to be clever. After several minutes of silence, Lena, the sharpest of the group, pointed to a series of boulders on the far side of the ravine. They were large, solid, and stacked in a way that seemed almost too perfect to be a natural formation. "Maybe we can use those rocks," she suggested, her finger tracing the boulders. "We could climb across, find a way to secure ourselves." Jarek nodded. "It's risky, but we don't have many options. We'll need ropes and the right gear." The team rummaged through their supplies. They had brought climbing gear, but it wasn't designed for something this challenging. They had to make do with what they had. As they worked together, securing ropes to the rocks and making sure everyone had the necessary equipment, the pressure weighed heavily on their minds. They were running out of time, and the setting sun reminded them that they had to hurry. As Jarek made the first climb, his muscles straining under the weight of the effort, he felt the eyes of the group on him. The tension was palpable, each person silently praying that he would make it across. The rocks were slippery, the wind pushing against him with every move. But finally, with a grunt of effort, he reached the other side, securing the rope for the rest of the group. One by one, the others climbed across, each person battling against the pressure, the fatigue, and the fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last member of the team, a quiet but determined man named Kellen, made it across. They had done it, but it hadn't been easy, and the ravine was just the beginning. There was more ahead, and with each challenge, the team realized just how much they still had to learn. The world around them was unforgiving, and they were no longer in control. "This isn't like Earth," Jarek said, his voice low as he surveyed the landscape on the other side of the ravine. "We're not in charge here." Tharvik, who had watched the group's progress from a distance, nodded slowly. "You're beginning to understand. This planet is not your home. Here, survival is about more than just strength. It's about being able to adapt when everything you know is taken away." The team had crossed the first major hurdle, but the journey ahead promised to be even harder. They had lost one of their own, survived the ravine, and learned a valuable lesson in humility. But in the harsh reality of this world, their survival was far from guaranteed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they knew that the true test was just beginning. The price of survival. The air had grown colder as the night fell, and the winds howled through the jagged rock formations surrounding the group. Their fire was small, but it was enough to push back the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. Everyone sat around it, huddled together, yet the silence between them felt as if an invisible wall had gone up. Malik's death was still fresh in their minds, and no one dared to speak of it aloud. They all knew that surviving this deadly world meant pushing the emotions aside. It was survival over sorrow. But the weight of the loss was becoming too much to ignore. Every step forward felt like a reminder of what they had already lost. Tharvik's eyes flicked over the group, assessing their tired faces. He didn't need to speak to know that their resolve was weakening. The loss of one person had shaken them, and the difficulty of the journey ahead would test them all further. He could see it in their eyes. The fear, the doubt. But that was precisely why he was here. "Get some rest," Tharvik ordered. "Tomorrow will be harder." Jarek, sitting beside the fire, glanced up at the alien. There was no emotion in Tharvik's voice, no sympathy. He was simply stating a fact. That was how the alien operated. The reality of the situation was always blunt, always harsh. There was no comfort, no hand to hold. In this world, comfort would get them killed. The group tried to settle down for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The fear of what lay ahead gnawed at them, and their minds refused to let go of the death they had witnessed. Malik hadn't been the first to die in a survival class, and he certainly wouldn't be the last, but the harsh reality that their time could come at any moment made their hearts race. By the time the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, the team was already awake, packing up their gear and preparing for what would come next. They had no time to mourn. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. The planet would not wait for them to catch up. "We keep moving," Jarek said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion that weighed him down. "We owe it to Malik." The others nodded silently, not needing to say anything more. They had made a pact in that moment, not just to survive, but to carry on in memory of their fallen teammate. They wouldn't let his death be in vain. Tharvik led the way as usual, his silent, calculating presence a stark contrast to the fragile human emotions swirling in the group behind him. The path ahead was even more treacherous than before, a dense jungle filled with towering trees and thick underbrush. The air was humid and heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with moisture. Every step felt like a risk, and they moved carefully, the weight of their packs making their journey slower than they had anticipated. Despite the difficulties, they pressed on. Tharvik's presence loomed over them, like a constant reminder of the stakes. There was no room for error. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and they would find themselves as just another casualty of the deadly planet they were trapped on. As they ventured deeper into the jungle, the sounds of the world around them grew louder. Birds, insects, and strange, unknown creatures filled the air with their calls, but it was not the soothing noise of nature. There was something unsettling about it, as if the planet itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to slip up. Then, the silence broke. A loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by a rustling noise that sent the group into a state of alert. Jarek's heart raced as he quickly scanned the area, his hand reaching for his weapon. The others did the same, eyes darting nervously. "What was that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jarek replied, his breath coming in short gasps. "Stay alert." They slowly moved forward, weapons drawn, each step heavier than the last. Their training had taught them to be cautious, to never let their guard down, but this was different. The tension in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Tharvik didn't say a word. He just continued forward, his eyes scanning the jungle around them, constantly assessing the environment. It was clear that he was used to this, used to the danger that lay just beyond the visible horizon. Another sound broke the silence, a low growl that sent chills down their spines. It came from somewhere deep within the jungle, too far to see but close enough to make their hearts race. Something was out there, and it was coming for them. The group stopped in their tracks, fear creeping up their spines. They had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. They weren't prepared for the unknown predator that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tharvik raised a hand, signaling them to stay still. His expression was unreadable, his body tense, as if every muscle in him was ready to spring into action. Then, without warning, a massive creature burst from the underbrush, its large, sleek body moving with terrifying speed. It was something they had never seen before. Its scales shimmered with an unnatural sheen, and its jaws were lined with rows of sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling yellow light. The group reacted instinctively, their training kicking in. Weapons fired, and they scattered, each one moving in different directions to avoid becoming easy targets. The creature's roar shook the ground beneath them, and it lunged at Jarek, its massive claws swiping through the air with deadly precision. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jarek could feel the weight of his body, his muscles straining to dodge the creature's attack. He rolled to the side just in time, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly claws. "Shoot!" Tharvik's voice rang out, cold and sharp. Jarek fired, his aim true. The creature staggered back, its roars turning to an eerie, strangled sound as it was hit. But it wasn't enough. The beast lunged again, and this time it was aimed straight at Jarek. But before it could make contact, Lena fired, landing a shot directly between the creature's glowing eyes. It stopped mid-attack, its body convulsing, and then, with a final pain screech, it collapsed to the ground. For a moment, all was still. The group stood in stunned silence, their hearts racing, adrenaline still pumping through their veins. They had survived the attack, but the reality of what had just happened set in. They had just faced death, and it was only the beginning. The price of victory. The jungle felt eerily quiet after the creature's final screech, faded into the thick, humid air. The adrenaline that had surged through the group moments before began to ebb away, replaced by a quiet, uneasy tension. They stood frozen, eyes locked on the fallen beast, as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Jarek was the first to move, slowly lowering his weapon. His hands still shook slightly, but he quickly wiped them on his pants, trying to shake off the fear that gripped him. His eyes scanned the ground where the creature lay, its body still twitching, as if even in death it was struggling to survive. He felt a mix of relief and sorrow. They had survived this time. But at what cost? Lena's breath was shallow, her face pale. She had fired the fatal shot, but she didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. She could still hear the creature's growls echoing in her mind, the way its massive claws had come so close to ending her life. It had been too close, too real. "We did it," Tharvik said quietly, his voice as calm and emotionless as ever. He stood a few feet away, his piercing eyes never leaving the creature's lifeless body. "But don't forget, survival is not a victory. It's simply the price of life on this planet." His words hung in the air like a cold warning, reminding them all that while they had overcome this challenge, it was far from over. Death could strike at any moment, and next time, they might not be so lucky. The group stood in silence for a moment longer, processing what had just happened. The jungle around them seemed to grow more oppressive with every passing second, as if the very planet was watching them, waiting for them to slip up. "We need to keep moving," Tharvik finally said. His voice was firm, unyielding. "This won't be the last creature you face. And if you hesitate, you'll die." The harsh reality of the situation settled in once again. They didn't have the luxury of mourning. They didn't have the luxury of resting. This planet was not kind to those who stopped moving, who allowed fear to paralyze them. Lena nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She felt her heart thumping in her chest as she looked at her companions. She knew the only way out of this jungle was through it. There was no turning back now. Jarek followed suit, hoisting his weapon over his shoulder. He shot one last glance at the beast they had killed. He wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or afraid. It was clear now that they had entered a world where every step was a gamble, and sometimes survival came at a price. The group continued to move forward, their steps heavier now. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its oppressive heat and thick underbrush making each movement feel more laborious. Their bodies ached, their muscles screamed for rest, but there was no stopping. They couldn't afford to. Tharvik led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, as if expecting another threat to jump out at any moment. The others followed in silence, their minds consumed by the events of the last few hours. As they walked, Jarek's thoughts wandered back to the creature. He had seen death before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. It was about something bigger, something more dangerous. Every time they took a step forward, they were pushing themselves further into the heart of a deadly, unknown world. And then there was the cost. Malik was still fresh in their minds. His absence was a weight none of them could escape. He had been the first to fall, but he wouldn't be the last. It was just a matter of time before one of them paid the ultimate price again. They reached a small clearing, and Tharvik signaled for them to stop. He crouched down, inspecting the ground carefully. His eyes narrowed, and the rest of the group gathered around him. "What's wrong?" Jarek asked, his voice low. Tharvik didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the ground, looking for something that was clearly hidden beneath the layers of leaves and dirt. Finally, he stood up and gestured for the others to approach. "Another sign of the planet's dangers," Tharvik said, his voice colder than usual. Jarek's stomach churned. "What is it?" Tharvik pointed to a series of strange markings on the ground, half buried under the foliage. They were not animal tracks. They were too deliberate, too precise. They were the markings of something intelligent. "Something is watching us," Tharvik muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it's not a creature this time." The air grew even thicker with tension. The group exchanged nervous glances. The predator they had just faced had been terrifying enough, but now they were dealing with something far more sinister, an intelligence that knew they were here and was waiting for the right moment to strike. Jarek's mind raced. How could they survive this? What kind of creature could leave such precise marks behind? The answer was simple. They were not alone on this planet. There was something, or someone, else out there, and they had been watching every step the group had taken. The silence grew heavier, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The jungle seemed to close in further, its sounds growing more distant, more alien. They had entered the unknown, and there was no telling what lay ahead. The unseen foe. The uneasy silence lingered in the air, heavier than the humid atmosphere that surrounded them. The markings Tharvik had discovered were a sign, a warning they could no longer ignore. The jungle, once filled with the sounds of distant creatures and rustling leaves, now felt ominously still. Whatever had made those markings was not just another predator. It was something far more dangerous, something with intelligence. Lena, usually calm and collected, couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that had settled deep in her chest. Her fingers tightened around her weapon as she scanned the thick foliage surrounding them. Every rustle, every movement in the underbrush seemed amplified, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. "Should we move?" Jarek asked, his voice hoarse, betraying the tension that had gripped him. "I don't like this. We're being watched." Tharvik didn't respond immediately. His sharp eyes continued to examine the ground, the markings he had found seeming to grow more unsettling with each passing second. "We move, but cautiously. We don't know what we're dealing with yet, but I can promise you this, it's not something you want to meet head-on." Lena's thoughts were racing, but they kept returning to Malik. The pain of losing him, of knowing that he hadn't had a chance to fight back, still gnawed at her. She couldn't let the same thing happen again. They had to survive, not just for themselves but for each other. They were a team, and that bond was all they had left in this unforgiving world. Tharvik motioned for them to move out, leading the group forward with calculated precision. His every step was measured, and he made it clear that they were no longer in familiar territory. The path they had taken to reach the clearing was no longer safe. They had crossed into enemy ground, and there was no telling what awaited them. The jungle felt different now. The air was thick with an oppressive tension, and the sounds of the creatures that once seemed distant now felt unnervingly close. Lena's heart raced as she tried to maintain her focus, but the growing unease was hard to shake. Something was out there, something watching them from the shadows. Jarek was on edge, his eyes darting to every corner of the dense foliage. He didn't like the way the trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches stretching like claws reaching out for him. The closer they moved to the unknown, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He tried to keep his breath steady, but it was getting harder to do so. Minutes passed like hours as they moved deeper into the jungle. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. They couldn't see their watchers, but they could feel them, eyes hidden in the dark corners of the jungle, tracking their every movement. Lena couldn't take it anymore. "We're being hunted, aren't we?" Tharvik didn't answer right away. His sharp eyes narrowed as he paused for a moment, listening intently. The jungle was eerily silent now. The distant calls of creatures had stopped, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to stretch for miles. "Yes," Tharvik said at last, his voice low and cold. "We're not alone here." The words were chilling, and the group fell into a tense silence, each of them now more aware of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of their vision. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more suffocating with every step. Tharvik motioned for them to move forward again, his pace quickening. He seemed determined to reach their destination before whatever was watching them could strike. But the sense of impending doom hung over them, thick and heavy, like a storm on the horizon. As they trudged forward, the air grew warmer, the humidity suffocating. Sweat dripped down Lena's forehead as she struggled to keep up. Her body was sore from the earlier battles, but it was her mind that was starting to give in. The constant feeling of eyes on her, of something just out of sight, was beginning to unravel her. "We can't stay out here much longer," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Stay alert," Tharvik snapped. "If we stop, we're dead. No more mistakes." Lena nodded, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't let fear overtake her. They had already paid a heavy price, and they couldn't afford to lose anyone else. But the deeper they moved into the jungle, the more desperate the situation became. They were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting to stay alive in a world where the enemy wasn't just a predator. It was something smarter, something that had a reason for hunting them. And that made them even more dangerous. As the group pushed forward, Tharvik's steps grew more cautious. He had sensed something earlier, something that none of them had noticed. A shift in the air, a slight change in the environment that signaled the presence of something not quite natural. He paused and signaled for the group to stop. "This is it," he whispered. "Get ready." The jungle had closed in around them completely. The thick foliage, the looming trees, and the distant sounds of the creatures had all disappeared, replaced by an unnatural quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath as if waiting for the inevitable. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A shape, barely visible in the underbrush, darted quickly between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be a normal creature of the jungle. The group tensed, weapons raised, but there was no sound, no growl, no hiss, no warning. The shadows shifted again, and suddenly, the group realized the terrifying truth. They weren't alone. The jungle was no longer a place of survival. It was a battlefield, and they were the prey. The predator's strike. The jungle seemed to close in even tighter as the group took a collective breath, their eyes scanning the dark shadows between the trees. The once familiar and comforting sound of leaves rustling underfoot was now replaced by a chilling silence that made their nerves spike. The air felt dense, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. No one dared to make a sound. Tharvik's hand slowly raised, signaling for the group to stay quiet. His eyes darted between the trees, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what they were dealing with. He could feel it now, a presence lurking in the shadows, waiting. It was too quiet. The jungle wasn't just a battleground anymore. It had become the hunting ground. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She clenched her fists tightly, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. The sudden realization that they were no longer in control of their fate sent a wave of dread over her. They were being hunted, and this was no longer about surviving the environment. It was about surviving the creatures that had adapted to it, and to them. Jarek, normally the most level-headed, was visibly shaking. The stories he had heard, the rumors of the jungle's deepest secrets, were all rushing back to him. He had thought they were just that, stories. But now, standing in the heart of the jungle, he was beginning to understand the terrifying truth. From somewhere deep in the underbrush, a flicker of movement caught Tharvik's attention. A blur too fast for the human eye to track, zipped between the trees. He swore under his breath. "We're surrounded," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The jungle that had once seemed vast and endless now felt claustrophobic, as if it was narrowing in on them. Tharvik didn't need to say more. The group instinctively raised their weapons, eyes darting around them. They could hear nothing but their own breaths, loud, ragged, betraying their rising fear. Suddenly, a shrill cry cut through the air, echoing like the scream of a wounded animal. The noise was followed by a series of footsteps, too many to be just one creature. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet, the vibrations making it clear that something massive was charging toward them. Tharvik's eyes narrowed. "Now," he shouted. Without thinking, they scattered in different directions, each of them hoping to find cover before the creatures descended on them. Lena sprinted for the nearest tree, using its thick trunk as cover. Her mind raced with possibilities. Who would strike first? How many were out there? And most importantly, Could they survive? A low growl erupted from the shadows, followed by another, closer this time. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, something unnatural. Lena's grip on her weapon tightened, and she squatted low, peering around the side of the tree, trying to make out any details of the creatures stalking them. There, barely visible in the dim light, were the first signs, two glowing eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the canopy. Then another pair, and another. Slowly, more pairs of glowing eyes emerged from the shadows, revealing the creatures that had been tracking them all along. They weren't like any predator Lena had ever seen. Their eyes were large, almost glowing, and their bodies, though humanoid, were sleek and muscular, built for speed and agility. Long claws extended from their hands, sharp and deadly. The creatures didn't move like animals. They moved like something intelligent, calculating. They were hunting in packs, coordinating their movements with precision. Tharvik, realizing the severity of the situation, snapped orders. "Stay calm. Watch your flanks. They're circling us." But even his words couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The creatures were getting closer, moving silently between the trees. There was no sound of footfalls, only the flicker of movement in the shadows, the occasional flash of those haunting, glowing eyes. Lena's mind raced. They were outnumbered, and worse, these creatures weren't just attacking on instinct. They were using strategy, planning their moves, making sure the group was divided. It was a game to them, a twisted hunting ritual. And they were the prey. A sharp movement to her left caught her attention. One of the creatures had moved too close, closing in on her position. Lena quickly pulled her weapon into position, her fingers trembling on the trigger. She wasn't sure if she could make the shot, but there was no choice. She had to act before it was too late. Her breath hitched as she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the jungle. The creature screeched, stumbling backward as it was struck, but it didn't fall. Instead, it snarled in fury, baring its teeth, eyes wild with rage. Tharvik's voice boomed through the chaos. "Fall back. We need to regroup." But it was too late. The creatures were already upon them, moving in with terrifying speed. Lena fired again, hitting one of the creatures in the chest. But it didn't slow down. Another pounced on Jarek from behind, knocking him to the ground. In the blink of an eye, the situation had gone from bad to worse. The predators had the upper hand now, and the group was in disarray, fighting for their lives. Lena's thoughts were consumed with one question. Would they survive this night? Or was this the end of the line for them? The sound of a loud crash echoed through the jungle, followed by the thud of heavy footsteps. It was a signal that the fight was about to escalate. There was no turning back now. The jungle had become their arena, and they had no choice but to face their relentless pursuers, no matter the cost. The ultimate price. The jungle was alive with the sounds of chaos. Screeches, snarls, and the distant thud of heavy footsteps echoed through the dense trees, each sound a grim reminder of how the group's survival was slipping away. Tharvik's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he fought to keep his team alive. He could see Lena, desperately trying to fend off one of the creatures, her face pale with exhaustion but determination in her eyes. Jarek was nowhere to be seen, lost in the confusion of the battle. The creatures had closed in on them, their glowing eyes now filled with an almost predatory delight. They were patient, methodical in their approach, as if they were enjoying the hunt, savoring the terror that their presence instilled. Tharvik's mind snapped back to the reality of their situation. The predators were not just hunting them, they were playing a game, and they were winning. Tharvik's breathing was ragged, and his weapon felt heavier with each passing second. He knew they were outmatched. The creatures were faster, stronger, and more attuned to the jungle than they could ever hope to be. They were playing by their rules now, and the Deathworlders were the prey. But then, through the madness, Tharvik caught a glimpse of Jarek. The young man was lying on the ground, struggling to get up, but the creature that had attacked him wasn't finished. It was circling, toying with its prey, and with each pass, it drew closer, its claws outstretched, ready to strike. Tharvik's pulse quickened. "No," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of battle. Without thinking, he sprinted toward Jarek, his weapon raised, ready to make the shot. But as he ran, he knew deep down that it might already be too late. They were all too far gone, caught in the predator's web. Lina's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and strained. "Tharvik, stop. It's a trap." He didn't stop. The sight of Jarek, struggling and helpless, pushed him forward. But as he got closer, Tharvik's blood ran cold. The creature wasn't alone. More shadows shifted in the trees around him, more predators closing in. Lina's warning was too late. Tharvik heard a soft, sickening snap as the creature lunged for Jarek, its claws digging deep into the young man's chest. The scream that followed was raw, a primal cry of pain and terror. Tharvik reached out, but it was no use. The creature was faster, stronger, and Jarek was already gone. The group's worst fear had come true. They had lost one of their own. The jungle's insatiable hunger had claimed its first victim, and there was no coming back from it. Lina's voice trembled as she watched in horror, her hands shaking as she fired at the creatures around them. "No, we can't lose him. We can't." But the battle was already lost. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss. The predators were all around them now, closing in with terrifying speed. Tharvik fought to steady his breathing, to find some way to make a last stand. But his thoughts kept returning to Jarek. The young man had been a fighter, a survivor, but even he hadn't been enough. The jungle, once an environment of opportunity, had turned into a death trap. The predators were relentless, their strategy honed over centuries, and the Deathworlders had been outmatched from the start. What had been a test, a survival class meant to challenge them, had turned into a nightmare. And now, they were fighting not just for survival, but for revenge. Lina fired again, a shot hitting one of the creatures in the eye. It recoiled, screeching, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it howled for reinforcements, and more shadows stirred in the underbrush. It was then that Tharvik realized the true cost of the battle they had been fighting. Survival wasn't just about overcoming the challenges of the jungle, it was about understanding the unforgiving nature of it. And now, the price had been paid. Jarek had given everything for the team. His sacrifice would not be forgotten. But Tharvik knew that the predators wouldn't stop until they had taken everything. "Get back," Tharvik shouted, pushing Lina toward cover. "This isn't over. Not yet." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. They were on borrowed time. The predators would not stop, and the ultimate price had already been paid. The jungle was their battlefield, and death was the only certainty.